On this episode of ArchiTech, we take a look at the security of the education facilities, how architects and technologists can come together, and what are the biggest concerns in the coming years. All that and more. Next on ArchiTech.
The network for the AV industry.
What are you listening to?
This
is AV.
This
is AVNation.
This is AVNation.
This is ArchiTech, Episode 9, recorded Wednesday, February 5th, 2020. Security rings.
Support for AVNation is brought to you by Atlas IED, innovative audio solutions for every business environment.
This is ArchiTech, the month we look at how the architecture space and the technology space can work together. My name is Tim Albright. I am your host. This month, we're going to talk about security, specifically education security, and how more and more pieces of legislation are being put in place. More and more manufacturers and honestly, more architecture firms are getting involved and earlier on in the space. With me to talk about that, first and foremost, Melissa McFadgen and John St. Pierre from NAC Architecture. Welcome to you both.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. And also with us is a good friend of ours, Ms. Gina Sansevero from Atlas IED. Welcome, ma'am.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Melissa, we'll start with you guys in NAC. When it comes to this space and when it comes to security, and it's something that obviously architects have been worried about, technology folks and technologists are getting more and more involved every single year. What are the biggest security concerns for education facilities today?
So the biggest concern that comes to mind for school districts is often the active shooter situation, the very aggressive intruder. And it clearly is something that captures a lot of media attention. It gets a lot of focus because it is incredibly tragic. And so while that is the biggest area of concern that districts grapple with in terms of understanding how to manage a school or campus to eliminate or at least control active intruders, what we're finding is that is a byproduct of a much bigger concern and issue that districts often need to look at it a step-by-step process, and that is that the bullying, the environment that the school and the educational environment that the students go to every day must make a student feel connected. They must feel like it's a safe place. They must feel like they have connections within that school environment to hopefully eliminate the very tragic situations escalating to the point of an active shooter. And so districts are grappling with this on many different levels, and it's a really challenging philosophical and community pressure point for districts to struggle with that we're talking about from day one. Often we're talking about school security before we even get the job, because it is so critical that we are well educated and aware of approaches that can be taken in the design process to minimize those risks.
All right, John, then how do you make a kid feel secure? How do you make a kid feel connected from an architect standpoint?
Well, to me, it's first get involved with the community so that the kids coming to school feel a sense of transparency when they get to school, and that security measures that we have in place don't overwhelm that unfortunate physical occurrence that seems to happen when we try to secure a building to make more of a bunker style, which is really not the approach we want to do. So we want to make them feel at home. We want to give them a sense of ease, and again, that transparency coming to, arriving to school, leaving school, transitions for parents that come that might need to interact with the staff and the teachers as well. So that's the kind of approach, Melissa.
Yeah, I think that some of the approaches, it's a real kind of tension in the fact that many of the data out there is saying that for students, to have a positive, engaging educational experience, there needs to be a lot of transparency. You're learning from your peers. You're learning from teachers that are across the way. There's a lot of positive staff and student interactions by a lot of transparency, the ability to connect, the ability to work in small groups, while at the same time, there is the pushback that, well, all of those students are vulnerable the second a shooter enters the premises because there's nowhere for a student to hide. And so it's this tension between the philosophical approach to be able to deliver education so you have that community and peer-to-peer connection that John's talking about, while at the same time keeping the students safe. And for a lot of people, safe means solid walls, not being able to see students, creating that bunker style approach that John's talking about. So it really becomes significant tension in the conversations. And one of the most important aspects is when you start talking to first responders and what they want relative to approaching a school and their needs, they are also advocates often of transparency. They want to be able to see into the building. They want to be able to be immediately aware of the activities that are occurring inside. They want to minimize hiding places. They want to minimize the ability for intruder to be in the building, and they as first responders can't see what's happening, nor can they see the students who are in the building who are in a threatening situation. So it's a really interesting and carefully navigated conversation to find that balance between transparency, a safe environment, and not having a bunker style where a student walking into a school and going through a metal detector is a very different experience than a student going through into the front doors of their school, feeling welcome, feeling safe, feeling embraced. So those are kind of the two extremes.
Yeah, absolutely. Gina, I want to bring in the technology side here because something that Melissa said there about you can't see, and first responders need to see, but there is absolutely a technology aspect of this here. And something that I learned years and years ago in theater is the more high tech we become, the more high touch we need to be, right? We need to make people feel welcome, especially students, especially in today's day and age. How can we as technologists kind of walk that line and assist architects and assist first responders and make sure that, yeah, it's safe, but it's also, it's inviting, but it's also, we can also give you eyes and ears on areas.
So I think that Melissa hit on it without necessarily saying this, but really preparedness. Preparedness is going to be the key here, and bringing in all stakeholders. Once you have a cleared emergency preparedness plan, is going to get everybody on the same page and ensure everybody stays on the same page. But without that emergency preparedness plan, those kind of differences of opinions, the kind of blockade or the bunker type of mentality versus the very open, transparent type of a mentality will always kind of have these clearly opposing viewpoints, but slightly more aggressively opposing. So you really want that emergency preparedness plan to be clear, and everybody to have buy-in. And once you have buy-in, there's technology that's going to support that plan rather than having a plan that supports technology. Right? So you don't want to put the cart before the horse, in other words. So as technology manufacturers and as technologists and integrators, we come in and we say, well, we have solutions for to enhance security, but you tell us first what your plan is. You tell us first what your vision for your school or your vision for your campus is, and then we can help to support that vision, because otherwise you're putting a square peg in a round hole. And so yes, Tim, we have solutions that will allow first responders to see through sensors and see if there's any movement in classrooms that they thought might be empty. We have the ability to show wayfinding so that students know where to evacuate for both visual and audio communications. So you have ADA compliance. We have all that stuff, but really where it starts is, what is the vision that you have for your school and campus, and then how can we support those initiatives?
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that's a great point, Gina, and that's often where we put the onus kind of back on the district, is because often we're working on a single building, and those districts have multiple buildings. And so it's not only the technology and the safety protocols that we're implementing in the new building or the renovated building, it's what are you doing at all of your other buildings that don't necessarily get touched right now, and how are you bringing everyone up to the same level so that you don't start to develop a have-nots, but then you also always go back to, here's what our safety protocol is, here's what our standard is. Every child will know what that means when this alarm is sounded, and these are the safety measures in place. And so that plan is absolutely critical. John and I were just talking about that, because we're the same in every aspect of which components of security do you implement, and which will be recognized by the district administration, the first responders, but then also most importantly, the staff and students who need to respond in an event of an emergency.
It's extremely important. I think one of the first steps to Gene and both Melissa have been mentioning is you have some kind of master plan in place, and that starts with the district. And however they decide to approach that, I mean, we can try to offer assistance across the board as integrators, as architects, but ultimately it starts with them, and they need to engage the administrators, the teachers, the students to determine what those, to assess that, find out what their risks are, and figure out how to leverage the technology to meet those needs.
And I think that's exactly the point. You know, what we've seen is that very often a school may bring in a consultant to talk about security technology. That consultant doesn't necessarily end up talking to the audiovisual staff or somebody outside of that security world. So when we're talking about, let's say, higher education, not even K-12, you have facilities, and you have campus safety, and you have audiovisual, and you have IT, and you have administration, and you have faculty, and you have staff, and you have students. And sometimes you don't get everybody in the same room to make those decisions with regard to campus safety. So when it comes to incorporating technology into that, it becomes even fewer of those stakeholders in the room, right? And that's really a challenge for us when we're talking to the AV staff about how to incorporate some of these technologies into their digital signage, where they can use that for critical alerts protocols and things like that. What happens when the IT department or the campus safety department is unaware that this is possible? And how does that, how does that oversight or overlook affect total campus preparedness?
We often talk about that exact thing in a very simple manner, but it's isolated. I think it illustrates the point perfectly, is that when we think about security, we think about it in concentric rings. And so you think about the largest ring being at your, basically your campus or your property perimeter. And so you have cameras there, you're seeing who's coming in, and then you go in one more ring and you see the front entry vestibule, and you've got a secure vestibule that's been hardened, it has all the technology, it has all of the bulletproof or intruder resistant glass. And as you work your way in, a lot of it is dependent on technologies, a lot of it is dependent on cameras and an individual recognizing that a threat is occurring. And so who has the time to sit there and monitor these 40 to 50 cameras and be able to identify a threat when it occurs? And that's really where the investment needs to sit, to alert and have these protocols in place that allow for certain cameras to be activated at certain times to allow for the technology to help support the safety measures so that it isn't all on the burden of a single individual watching 40 cameras at a time, because that's not realistic. You're likely not going to catch the threat if that's your utilization of technology.
Yeah, I mean, Tim, you remember our event in Atlanta where
Yep.
we were talking to a bunch of colleges and universities about what they were campus AV service providers. So they provided service to their campus, but they were like in-house integrators. So they worked on campus for the school. And we asked them, how often do you get involved in campus safety and security integration? And by and far, most of them said they don't, unless they're specifically asked, and that's well into the process. They don't necessarily get involved. Now, we had a couple, and it was really interesting, who were brought in as part of their emergency management task force on campus. But that is so rare. Based on what we had seen. And more often than not, we leave that to the security group, and the security group outsources it.
Yeah.
Campus safety outsources monitoring of cameras and even infrastructure upgrade and things like that. And the only thing that the campus AV and IT teams are involved with is when the campus safety comes to them and says, we need a data drop here for our network. And that's unfortunate, because it seems, and this is a generalization and somebody is going to get upset with me, but it seems that for whatever reason, campus safety technology is not as evolved, or they don't upgrade it as often as they could. Whereas AV and IT, they know new technologies, they know new requirements for infrastructure, they know, all of the cutting edge things. Whether or not they can afford it is a different story. But who gets the budget is campus safety, and AV and IT understand the technology, and they're not being brought into that conversation. And there's a frustration there that you can absolutely see. I mean, we saw it in that event in Atlanta.
Well, let me bring one more thing into here real quick, Gina, is the fact that there are technologies that this is not even the left hand not telling the right hand what you're doing. You're talking about completely separate industries here. And one is airports that I've learned an awful lot. Honestly, working with Gina the last year or so, they have facilities and they have the technologies in airports that are not just notifications, right? That your this flight is leaving here, but they also have emergency notification systems on those same backbones. And it seems to me, and I'll have all three of you guys chime in on this, where there are technologies in other areas and other systems out there that we're not leveraging either in education, right? Or there are where they do wayfinding really well, and then they do cameras systems really well, and they have the emergency beacons, the 911 beacons out in the parking lots, where at airports they do other systems really well where they could leverage what they do in education. Maybe the two of them should start talking, right? Or the architects and the technologists that work in these other areas, because we're so tied into our own little silos where we're like, hey, you know what? Maybe education folks should start talking to hospitality or hospital folks.
It will be more on the technology side of it, kind of like Gina. The biggest thing I'm starting to see, and I think this goes across all industries, not just schools, higher ed, is the integration piece of it. That we have, you get into a project and you'll have multiple people doing different systems on the project. To your point, Gina and Tim, is that you're going to have AV guys doing stuff, you're going to have the IT folks doing stuff. All of it's using pretty much the same infrastructure background, but the other intimate pieces out there for the video, the access control, the intrusion, these elements are all usually by different vendors, and they're not necessarily a single person that talk together to make this stuff work. And ideally, these systems need to be seamless for the user. They need to be all integrated, and they need to be able to communicate with basically behind the scenes, so that on my phone I can pull up that video seamlessly and I can tell what happened at this door, at this camera. And I think that's lacking right now in our industry, is having that central integration point, or that piece. So Gina, are you seeing that too as well?
Yeah, for sure. And what's really interesting is that, like you said, they're all networked equipment. So there is a possibility to have a central repository. There are a bunch of manufacturers in our industry and beyond who have this ability to monitor anything on the network. I mean, we have that capability to be able to monitor anything on the network, see if it's picking anything up, or seeing if it's the status of the equipment. Is it on? Is it off? Is it in a restart mode? What's wrong with it? Being able to remotely identify problem areas is absolutely key. What we're finding, or what I've been seeing, is that the hardest place to probably do that is outdoor areas. So inside you have the ability to really kind of hone in on monitoring of equipment. Outdoor equipment might be a little bit more difficult, or especially areas where you don't have coverage from some of that equipment. But yes, absolutely, as I kind of derail that conversation, absolutely, I definitely see the ability for technology to act as a central repository for all networked equipment, but the non-use, I mean.
Video analytics has really come a long way, I think, especially with dealing with the exterior type of applications where they can identify areas or activity that wants, you can flag it, recognize it, and then warn or alert on it. So that's kind of interesting.
I think the other area, similar to the outdoors, that we often see a challenge is because we're in the K-12 environment, in any environment where you're dealing with kids, you're dealing with minors. Mm-hmm. And so the privacy aspects relative to recording, to reviewing, publishing any information, and where we're really seeing the outdoors is certainly one. The other that's interesting struggle, and it is related to security in the aspect that gender neutral restrooms, and how do you deal with the restroom situation in high school, particularly in a high school setting, in the locker room situation, where you're able to, there's the technology out there that allows you to monitor what's happening inside those individual restrooms. So if you go to a model where it's non-gender specific, they're just individual stalls, and maybe there's a sensor on the outside of the door that tells you, an administrator can stand there and say, it's green, meaning there's only one person in there, they're not vaping, everything's fine. If it's red, some naughty business is happening or something's occurring. There's the technology out there to overcome some of these issues relative to security and making sure students are safe and they have equal access. But it gets really challenging when you're dealing with minors, and how you make sure that these areas that are more challenging to cover, like the outdoors, like restrooms, locker rooms, those kinds of spaces, they're using technology, but the technology is able to be brought together and woven together to be a single source. So it's still very easy and seamless for the administrators to use it to the best of their ability, because if it's not being used to the best of the ability, it's going to be abandoned.
Yeah.
And that's always the challenge.
That we are seeing that absolutely. It has to be a simple interface, and it's not even about identifying a problem, but then what do you do when the problem is identified? How do you provide instruction? How do you provide instruction in multiple ways so that everybody, no matter where they are, understand what those instructions are clearly? But that interface becomes really, that's all that the user sees. So that becomes the ideal product, right? No. That becomes what you're known for.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you guys this, because we've talked about this a little bit in gathering all the different stakeholders. Melissa, I'll start with you on this. From an architect standpoint, how do you gather all the information and all the needs and wants and desires of all the different stakeholders, and then convert that into a language, a common language, that all of the trades, right? Whether it's electricians, it's an IT designer, it's a security expert, it's a AV folks, it's architects, it's engineers, whoever, a common language that everybody can understand exactly what those needs are. And what is that common language?
Yeah, good question. Boy, I wish this was a one-size-fits-all answer. I think it goes back to what Gina was saying. There's a lot to be said about just best practices and standards established by a district, because there is literally an infinite number of ways to solve problems anymore. And so I think there's that aspect that is relative to kind of the nuts and bolts. Here's what we do at every school. It goes back to parity, it goes back to district standards and maintaining and all those things. Where we spend a lot of time, and we're finding we're spending more and more time, is before we ever draw a line on paper, we have conversations, and this is a term from the lean process, of conditions of satisfaction, or what are your principles that we need to achieve on this project. So we are identifying very early the priorities and the needs of the user groups, both, and typically in the room, it's administrators, staff, occasionally students, often community members, parents, and they're communicating to us, here's the things that this facility has to achieve for us to view it as a success. And so you identify early on what everyone's prioritized as their need. They're in the same room as those who are expressing other needs, so they can start to develop empathy for those that may not be on our radar screen, because often what a community member wants versus what a maintenance person wants versus administrator is very different. So building that framework early on, and then it is our job as architects to say, okay, mechanical engineer, electrical engineer, here's what this means to you. This means that this is the need that they have because of this desire that's been expressed, and here's how we need to accomplish it, given all the other parameters. So I think it's the upfront work to make sure that all the users and all the individuals who will be using the building will have an awareness of what the goals are, using the district or client standards that have already been put in place, and then making sure that that is our charge. And to the point where often in design meetings, we will start the design meeting with the top 10 principles. And so that it's a constant reminder throughout. When the contractor comes on board, we give it to them to say, here's what they've said is their priorities.
Yeah.
And to that end, it's about, that's where the human touch comes in. You know, robots can't necessarily do that. We always are talking about automation and all those things, but that's our job as architects, to be those ringleaders and make sure that everyone has that information in hand.
I think it's important that you involve the engineers and the architects as early on in the process as seems reasonable as well, because as a technologist, it has a huge impact on what can be accomplished, cannot be accomplished, and without getting into the weeds of it, you can really assess whether the strategy or plan or intent or narrative, if you want to call it that, what their need is. You can get some feedback on that earlier before it goes down that path.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cost is always it's a big component in decision making, and when individuals make an investment in a particular aspect of the building, it needs to work. And so that's where you really need to have the experts at the table early on to be able to provide educated advice and feedback on how things can be accomplished.
Yeah, we're working with integrators who are getting trained by experts. We have an association called the National Systems Contractor Association that was part of or co-founding the Pass K-12 initiative, which is the Partner Alliance for Safer Schools. And this came about a few years ago in the wake of Sandy Hook. And what PASS does is it attempts to provide guidelines for security on K-12, in K-12 districts, on their campuses, and in their buildings. So there's different tiers, and those tiers are similar to what Melissa had said, almost like concentric circles. And PASS K-12 identifies from the furthest boundary to the inside of the classroom what security technology, processes, and protocols are available to help them meet PASS K-12 guidelines. So from a technology standpoint, it could be digital, it could be analog. They identify both, but what they're doing is they're arming technology integrators with this information to be able to have these conversations, very frank, honest conversations with district administrators to be able to help to make some of those decisions easier. Now, again, not bypassing the need for them to fit technology into the preparedness plan, or to have it support the preparedness plan and not the other way around. But Pass K-12 is one of those initiatives that allows the technology world to kind of become a little bit more educated about that.
I think that is an initiative that many entities they're taking on themselves. Michael Pinto is a principal in our Los Angeles office, and he recently sat on a committee that was formed in the wake of Parkland, and it was the city of Los Angeles, and they were basically developing some of those similar concepts where it was kind of talking about guidelines and establishing protocol for what a safe and secure environment looks like for students to get from home to school and back safely, and what that looks like every step of the way. And it is something where the framework that was developed out of Sandy Hook and other very tragic experiences, they're using those as lessons for people to feel like they don't have to start from ground zero, that they can start with educated decisions that individuals have put together that really help districts customize it to suit what their community needs. And that's a really critical aspect to making sure, again, that the lines of communication are open and expectations are aligned.
Yep.
Absolutely. All right, guys, that is actually going to do it for this conversation, even though we could probably keep going for another hour, and we may very well just do that in a couple of months, revisit this. So thank you all so much. Melissa McFadgen and John St. Pierre from NAC Architecture, thank you both so much.
Thank you very much. It was a true pleasure again.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Again. How do people get a hold of you guys or NAC?
You can go to our website at nacarchitecture.com, and both John and I, our first initial last name at NAC Architecture is our email. We, of course, have all the typical Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, so please feel free to join.
Very good. And Ms. Gina Sansevero from Atlas IED, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you again for having me. I love this group. I want to have another podcast with this group. We're getting along so well. So atlasied.com, Atlas_IED on Twitter, Atlas IED on Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn, and you can find me at Gina Sands on Twitter.
Very good. For me, don't follow me, but go by the website if you would, please. AVNation.tv. That's AVNation.tv. You will find this program and a host of others, including our 2 weekly news programs. One is Resi Week and one is AV Week. Resi Week looks at the residential side, and AV Week looks at the commercial side of the AV industry. While you are there, please check out our supporter section. These are the folks who help us financially, help us bring you ArchiTech and AV Week and Resi Week and our coverage of ISE 2020. And Atlas is one of those, and we thank them for their support. So all of that and more at avnation.tv. That's avnation.tv. Thanks so much for listening. That's all the time we have for